Well, welcome to everyone. I am Mike Andrews, the president of the Jack Miller Center, and we are very grateful that you've joined us today. We are gathered here to talk about free speech. I'm sure you've heard report after report about the unhappy state of free speech on all too many of our colleges and universities. Speakers disinvited, uncivil student behavior, students increasingly unwilling to speak their minds, speech codes. It may be helpful to think briefly about the Greek word for speech, logos. It means simultaneously speech, reason, or the logic behind an argument. All this implies that if human beings have a mind, they have a natural tendency to speak it. We also know that while an individual person might want to speak his or her mind freely, they often don't like it when others do the same. Our colleges and universities have long been charged with helping students develop their ability to speak freely and reasonably, and to patiently work their way through ideas they may find challenging, difficult, or flat out wrong. It seems today that the institutions charged with this responsibility are too often failing in their mission. The Jack Miller Center exists to support faculty who care not only about the vital importance of free and open inquiry, but who also care about presenting students with hard questions about human nature, political life, always with the hope that students will come to a deeper appreciation of human liberty and the sources of human flourishing. Our panel today will address the topic of free speech on campus, and we are very happy to have Bill Kristol moderating our panel. Bill is the founder and editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard, a journal of politics and ideas in Washington, D.C. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. He is happily a very welcome new addition to the Jack Miller Center Board of Directors. He is a regular on ABC's This Week and other leading political commentary shows, such as CNN's Crossfire, MSNBC's Morning Joe, and Fox's Special Report. He is also the host of a popular new web series, Conversations with Bill Kristol. Bill served as chief of staff to Vice President Dan Quayle during the first Bush administration and to Secretary of Education Bill Bennett's staff during President Reagan's administration. Before coming to Washington in 1985, Bill was on the faculty of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and also at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Bill received both his AB and his PhD from Harvard University. So if you'll join me in welcoming Bill Kristol and our panel.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you all for coming. I'm very much looking forward, actually, to learning something from my fellow panelists here. This is an excellent group. I won't read their biographies. You've got them in the little pamphlet, but Diana Schaub, Bill McClay, and Peter Berkowitz, I think we'll go in that order, are all excellent scholars, very thoughtful about current events, very thoughtful about universities and their place in a liberal democracy. I've encouraged them each to think broadly about the question that we're discussing, free speech on campus. Campus can mean guest speakers, it can mean faculty, it can mean students. Free speech can mean free expression and sort of the ability to say what you want. It can also imply freedom of thought and sort of a deeper meaning, as Mike suggested, of free speech. So I hope we won't confine ourselves, I think, to simply listing examples of people being shouted down or something like that, but really try to think about the current state of genuine free speech, free discourse, free thought on our campuses, and I think more broadly in our society, since the two are obviously related. So they'll each speak for about 10 minutes, and we'll have a little discussion among ourselves and open it up for questions. So, Diana.
Okay, thanks. In thinking about the American scene, it's never bad to start with Alexis De Tocqueville. And this is especially true when what the great diagnostician had to say does not flatter us. His most hurtful observation is probably this one: I do not know any country where, in general, less independence of mind and genuine freedom of discussion reign than in America. How can he say this of the nation that enshrines freedom of speech, press, assembly, and petition in its First Amendment? Apparently, the constitutional guarantee of freedom of speech does not produce freedom of mind. Observing the America of the 1830s, Tocqueville says emphatically, there is no freedom of mind in America. The culprit is tyranny of the majority, the same phenomenon we today call political correctness. It turns out that PC is not a recent development at all. Indeed, Tocqueville believes that political correctness is natural to democracy. There will be societal dogmas enforced not by law, but by public opinion. Among democratic peoples, it is public opinion that rules. This form of rule is psychological rather than physical. Tocqueville says it goes straight for the soul. The very potent threat of social disapproval and ostracism pressures individuals to conform. They self-censor and are silent. If they make the mistake of expressing unacceptable opinions, they may be driven to apologize or recant. Very few are willing, Tocqueville says, to be the butt of mortifications every day. Perhaps, though, I've been too hasty in saying that political correctness is identical to the phenomenon described by Tocqueville. Since the 1980s, the term PC has usually been meant as a rebuke or a complaint, which suggests either we have become more aware of the tyrannical tendency of public opinion, or that public opinion in our day has not fully coalesced into irresistibility. Certainly, political correctness is perceived by many as a dogmatic imposition rather than unquestionable truth. Tocqueville notes that as long as the majority is doubtful, one speaks. But when it has irrevocably pronounced, everyone becomes silent. This means that during unsettled times, there's both more scope for free speech, but perhaps also more open and direct assaults on free speech. Since the left today has not entirely succeeded in crafting a new public philosophy, it's been tempted to deploy other methods to make its opinions prevail. It resorts to the coercion of law in the form of speech codes or bureaucracy-mandated sensitivity training. Those who are more impatient have turned from law to mob law. Fueled by outrage, vigilantes muster the democratic force of number against the holders of adverse opinions. And much of this activity occurs on college campuses, where the minds of the next generation are being formed. Just as it's helpful to remember Tocqueville's diagnosis of democracy's ingrained disinclination to free thought, it might also be helpful to remember that we've experienced earlier times where opinions were in flux, or when two radically dissimilar opinion sets were in competition. The most dramatic and destructive, of course, was the crisis over slavery, the crisis of the House divided. Then, too, the conflict revolved, at least initially, around the status of speech. Southern defenders of slavery attempted to police the boundaries of allowable speech. So, for instance, Southern postmasters, with the approval of the Postmaster General, refused to deliver abolitionist literature. In Congress, a gag rule was in place from 1836 to 1844, which prevented anti-slavery petitions from being received or debated out of deference to Southern sensitivities. In the North, mobs regularly attacked abolitionist meetings, destroyed printing presses, and in 1837 murdered the editor of an abolitionist newspaper. It was becoming clear that the system of human bondage was claiming further victims. The enslavement of blacks imperiled the civic freedoms of whites as well. Now, I don't want to overdraw the similarities between then and now, especially since we know that it took a civil war to resolve the conflict between those who thought slavery right and those who thought it wrong. We are not today in a situation with just one overriding moral issue with a dangerously sectional cast to it. We have issues, plural. Although it does seem that instead of being cross-cutting and thereby moderating in their effects, these issues align and further reinforce the growing national division. However, these divisions today are not geographic in any thoroughgoing sense. Red states and blue states are simply not analogous to free states and slave states. Still, the situation is grave enough that it's been described as a cold civil war. Charles Kessler, in a recent piece, speaks of the nation as divided between two rival constitutions, two cultures, two ways of life. The first term, I think, there, rival constitutions, is the key one. The conflict centers on interpretations of the Constitution, pitting the inherited or original or conservative Constitution against the progressives' invention of the ever-evolving living Constitution. The best solution, the solution that Abraham Lincoln pursued throughout the 1850s, is persuasive political speech, combining moral clarity with prudential compromise, all in the service of reconstituting a shared conception of our common purposes. As Lincoln argued, just a quote from Lincoln, "In this and like communities, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Consequently, he who molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces decisions. He makes statutes and decisions possible or impossible to be executed." So, what role can the nation's universities play in this task of reviving the nation's founding principles, especially given that administrators and faculty are so ideologically skewed leftward? Well, the prospects are not promising. My own view is that the controversies over free speech are a symptom rather than the main issue. It is, of course, encouraging that some old-fashioned liberals are joining with conservatives to come to the defense of free speech, and it is imperative to make young people aware of the rationale for free speech and its link to self-government. But we should always remember that freedom of speech is no guarantee of independence of mind. It's possible to achieve independence of mind without freedom of speech. We know that deep thinkers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn have arisen in totalitarian regimes. A diluted version of such dissent is occurring on campuses today, I think as a reaction against left-wing overreach. I spoke with a very brave conservative student at Harvard just a couple of days ago. He said he thought it had been personally very good for him to be at an institution where he had to be prepared to substantiate every statement he made in opposition to the reigning orthodoxies. I am worried, though, about the fate of students less spirited than he. They will either follow the intellectual fashion, or perhaps more troubling, they will withdraw and fall silent. Although my evidence is purely anecdotal, I've observed that students, especially those who aren't pursuing political science as a major, are much more hesitant in class discussion than they were just a decade ago. I don't think this is primarily a response to speech codes or the other active measures instituted by college administrators. So far as I can determine, the chilling effect emanates from the tyranny of social media. I usually end my intro politics class with a week or two on Tocqueville. Reading the section on tyranny of the majority has become like a dam bursting. Suddenly, every student in class, even those who have been resolutely mum all semester, will become vocal. They speak of their fear of being attacked on social media and how that fear restricts conversation to the most superficial, most trivial of topics. It's their peer group that suppresses speech. Outright censorship, or perceived indoctrination by higher-ups, usually triggers eye-rolling, mockery, and resistance in the young. For that we can be thankful. But the disapproval of one's peers is psychologically devastating. So what results is not so much groupthink as non-think. It's a flight from and positive aversion to thinking. And eventually, I suppose, the atrophying of the capacity for thinking. This is our biggest danger. Safe spaces are spaces emptied of thought. The only real antidote is liberal education, or philosophically informed civic education, such as that supported by the Jack Miller Center. Yes, we need to leap to the defense of free speech, but as individuals, we need to be in quest of a higher aim, freedom of mind. And for that, one needs to expose oneself to those dangerous texts of old. My short list would include the Bible, Plato and Aristotle, Shakespeare, the American founders, Abraham Lincoln, and Frederick Douglass.
Thank you, Diana. Several questions which I will wait to address to you after. That's very stimulating and really terrific. Bill McClay.
Yeah, we each of us has just a little bit of time, and so I want to put out a couple of propositions, and I mean them to be provocative. I hope to provoke a little bit to encourage discussion. Jack Miller Center, which has been mentioned already a couple of times, is an organization that's dedicated to the teaching of America's founding principles. So I feel justified in the approach that it's going to exemplify this value of looking back in order to see what's wrong with the place where we've ended up at the present time. So my two thoughts stem from thinking about the two words, free and speech. What exactly do we mean by them when we can join them the way we do? Let me start with the second word, speech. And here I have to regretfully express some disagreement, disappointment maybe is a better word, with the Chicago principles, which you're going to be hearing about from President Zimmer, who probably showed me to be entirely wrong in my reservation, so I hope so. But you'll recall that they are called the Chicago Principles of Free Expression. They're not the Chicago Principles of Free Speech. And in my view, this is not a small difference. By the way, the Woodward Report, 1975, Stephen Woodward at Yale did a superb report in defense of free speech. It's also called freedom of expression. So this is not only the University of Chicago's problem. But in my view, the justification for free speech is that it is speech. Let me explain what I mean by that. I mean to say that speech has a special dignity. It's the human gift par excellence. Philosophers since Aristotle have insisted on this, that speech is the medium through which we engage in rational deliberation. We conduct the political life. It's the way we argue. It's the way we work things out together, sometimes solve problems, sometimes state and apply moral principles, principles of action. It's the way that we're able to be political animals, as Aristotle phrased it, not just animals that live together, but animals that deliberate together. We've been losing a sense of this special property of words, a special province. Speech occupies a kind of middle ground between thought and action, properly. It's a sort of buffer zone in which we can consider things prior to acting on them. The whole idea of free speech depends on speech being securely situated in this middle zone. Not entirely confined to it, but situated in it. Expression, however, freedom of expression. Expression is a very different word. It's a romantic word. It's an emotion-laden word. It refers to forms of communication that may or may not be verbal in character. They may not be part of a deliberative process. Even the etymology of the word expression, it goes back to the Latin for pressing out. Espresso, hot water's pressed through. So expressive liberty tends to be an explosive but one-way thing. It's a monologue. It's a cry of the heart. It's Sammy Davis Jr. singing, "I've Gotta Be Me." It's all about speaking my truth, my narrative, my voice. You must listen to it, and uncritically, preferably. So freedom of expression, I think in this sense, is not what the founders and framers had in mind in instituting the First Amendment to the Constitution. Hence the value of looking back and sort of reorienting ourselves. Part of the problem we have today, I think, is precisely because we have, over a period of many years, not just yesterday, and Supreme Court decisions have played a part in this, we've confused speech and expression. When the American Nazis marched through Skokie, not far from here, were they engaged in speech or expression? What about a gesture like flag burning? Is that speech? or expression? If these things are speech, what do they say? I'd be interested to know. Isn't the point of using an expressive gesture rather than words precisely that the words can be answered and countered and argued with, but gestures can't be answered? Gestures can only be answered by another gesture, an unanswerable gesture followed by an unanswerable gesture. You block me, I block you. You scream, I scream, we all scream. So much of the armory of present-day political protest is all about expression. Taped up mouths, armies of decked-out handmaids, staged screaming, all the rest, as if these things were speech. I could multiply examples, and so could you, but the point is we've come to accept passively the notion that these are expressive acts are forms of speech, but in fact, I would argue they're the opposite of speech, rightly understood. By equating free speech with free expression, we deny the specific dignity and the special qualities of speech as a medium of deliberation, as this middle ground between thought and action, as this instrument that enables us to deliberate together, to seek and validate and test the truth. And we miss the fact that what we call free speech actually involves obedience to a whole set of procedural norms, which are the necessary ground of that freedom. You can't have a debate unless you have rules. And the confusion works in the other direction. Just as actions have become interchangeable with words, so words have become regarded as a form of action. Last spring at Middlebury College, some of you will remember, violent students shut down a talk by the sociologist Charles Murray. And one of the ways they shut him down was by chanting, "Words are violence." Words are violence, which is a paraphrase, maybe not entirely fair, of Toni Morrison's 1993 Nobel Literary Prize address. But in other words, they were saying that the speech can be a form of violence, and violence can be a form of speech at Middlebury, at Berkeley, in the streets, and many other places. So what we've lost in this crazy formulation is a recognition that the realm of speech, properly understood, properly cared for, is an essential buffer zone, as I've called it before, between thought and action. It's a holding pen. It's a neutral place where we can hold things out for our common consideration, put them on the table before ourselves and consider them together. Speech is the realm par excellence of civility. To make speech into action and action into speech is ultimately to negate the value of speech entirely. There's much talk of safe spaces, which Dr. Schaub has alluded to in the contemporary academy. But words really are the only safe space in the contemporary intellectual life, because they're the place where dangerous things, like the dangerous books you want your students to read, can be explored safely without entailing immediate consequences. C. Van Woodward, whose report I mentioned a minute ago, had a characterization of the academy in that report, which is hard to recognize in the academy as it is now. It's the place where we enjoy the right to think the unthinkable, discuss the unmentionable, and challenge the unchallengeable. There is not a great deal of that going on, and we can't recover it without first recovering that sense of the special dignity and standing of words. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bill McClay. Peter Berkowitz.
I want to thank the Jack Miller Center for this welcome opportunity to discuss a topic of the first importance. In these brief remarks, I want to first stress that the troubles that beset liberal education in America have been a long time in the making. And second, that the struggle for free speech is bound up with the struggle also for due process and the struggle for a solid core curriculum. And all three, struggle for free speech, struggle for due process, struggle for core curriculum, are part and parcel of the struggle for liberal education. So first, a brief history of the decline of liberal education in America, kind of documentary history. In 1951, the young William F. Buckley published a book called God and Man at Yale, 1951. It documents the use of the curriculum to advance progressive aims. In the late 1960s, the public interest devoted a special issue to universities. At the time, students on campus were demanding the transformation of the curriculum into a vehicle for achieving left-wing social change. In numerous cases, administrators and professors complied. In the 1970s, many students of the 1960s brought to graduate school programs in the humanities and the social sciences the belief that teaching and scholarship should be understood as politics by other means. In the late 1980s, not long after the first wave of the 1960 students became tenured professors, an obscure professor of political philosophy at the University of Chicago published a book about the decline of higher education that became an unlikely New York Times bestseller. In The Closing of the American Mind, Alan Bloom argued that colleges taught a dogmatic relativism that impoverished students' souls and left them ill-prepared to understand liberty and self-government. Bloom advocated a return to the study of the great books. In the late 1990s, actually 20 years ago this year, 1998, University of Pennsylvania professor Alan Charles Kors and attorney Harvey Silverglate published a book called The Shadow University. The Shadow University. They carefully examined higher education's betrayal of free speech and due process. I repeat, that was 20 years ago. They were documenting the betrayal of due process that had transpired during the late 80s and throughout the 1990s. In 1999, Kors and Silverglate established the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE. Over the last 20 years, the organization has confronted a mounting workload of cases involving the defense of free speech and the defense of due process. Instead of putting itself out of business, which is what the founders thought they would be doing within a decade, instead of putting itself out of business, which was its goal, FIRE finds itself after 2 decades in 2018 bigger and busier than ever. The curtailing of free speech and the denigration and dilution of due process on campus are not, I think, isolated and independent. They are intertwined. They are also connected to the hollowing and deep and politicization of the curriculum. All three, the struggle over free speech, the struggle over due process, the struggle over the curriculum, are rooted in what John Stuart Mill called an assumption of infallibility. An assumption of infallibility. That is a presumption to know that one's own opinions are thoroughly true and opposing opinions are altogether false. To remedy the problems on our campus in any one of these areas, free speech, due process, the curriculum, would require progress in remedying all three. I'm going to limit myself to 4 observations about free speech, about the debate over free speech on campus. First, the demands to limit free speech on campus are typically made on behalf of historically discriminated against minorities and women. It's asserted that harmful and hateful speech hinders their participation on campus. And Lord knows there is such a thing as harmful and hateful speech. But the fact is that the majority of undergraduates around the country are women. Women have been a majority on campuses for some time. In fact, 2018, fall of 2018, I believe women constituted approximately 56% of undergraduates in the country. Together with historically discriminated against minorities, actually women form a supermajority on campus. That is, if you add up all the women and all the historically discriminated against minorities. This supermajority, or its campus advocates, are doing what majorities have always done, as Diana suggested, especially in democracies: shut off, close down, and stamp out the speech of others. They impose their will to silence divergent views and dissenting opinion. Second, as a historical matter, far from a tool of oppression, free speech has generally been a weapon of those who lack political power, who question authority, and who prize thinking for themselves, even though it's true that free speech is not identical to a free mind. Third, campuses that uphold free speech are by nature diverse and inclusive, giving to each, regardless of race, class, or gender, the opportunity to think and discuss, to change the minds of, and have their minds changed by others. And such campuses, we sometimes hear that there's a conflict between freedom of speech and community. It's a conflict because in a regime of freedom of speech, disagreeable opinions will be uttered. But in fact, and this will drive people out of the community, but in fact, campuses where freedom of speech governs form a special kind of community, a community dedicated to intellectual exploration and the pursuit of truth. Fourth, too often, universities encourage students to see themselves as weak and wounded, frail and vulnerable, and to see certain opinions as essential to their identity, and to believe that opinions that contradict their own perpetrate violence against their person, and, to use a term of art one hears on campuses a lot these days, invalidates their humanity. Opinions with which they disagree invalidate their humanity. An opinion invalidating your humanity. Actually, our colleges and universities should be encouraging students to view themselves as made of sterner stuff. We should instead train students to be strong, skeptical and curious, conscientious and bold, attentive, cool and clear. We should teach students to see the acquisition of knowledge and the quest for truth as essential to their identities. What is to be done? In the near term, colleges and universities should adopt measures that have already been laid out in model state legislation drafted by the Goldwater Institute. For example, private as well as public universities should abolish all speech codes and all other forms of censorship, publish a formal statement setting forth the purposes of free speech, or, notwithstanding its limitations, adopt the University of Chicago's Statement of Principles. All colleges and universities should do what almost no college or university does, which is create freshman orientation programs on free speech. Colleges and universities should punish those who shut down or otherwise disrupt speech. They should host an annual lecture on the theory and practice of free speech. They should issue an annual report on the state of free speech on campus. And this suggestion comes from an earlier report put out by the University of Chicago, the Calvin Report. Colleges and universities should strive where possible. Admittedly, it's not always possible, but they should strive where possible for institutional neutrality on the great partisan controversies of the day, the better to serve as an arena for vigorous debate about the enduring questions. But suppose our colleges and universities adopted all those proposals. The problems of free speech on campus still would not be cured. And they won't be cured without making progress in dealing with the dilution of due process on campus, particularly in cases involving allegations of sexual assault, and without dealing with the hollowing and politicization of the curriculum. Like the attack on free speech, the denial of due process rests on this Mill's assumption of infallibility. The denial of due process supposes that universities may determine guilt without beginning from a presumption of innocence, without the cross-examination of witnesses, without making available to the accused all the evidence against him. The accused is almost always a man. Without the provision of competent counsel to the accused, and without other vital features of fundamental fairness. The denial of due process injures not only particular individuals, it sends a message campus-wide that in regard to accusations of sexual assault, nothing need be said on the other side of the matter. We know. Nothing could be more contrary to the spirit that nourishes free speech. The assumption of infallibility is again at work in the hollowing and politicizing of the curriculum. Much of the curriculum these days presupposes that either the history of our civilization is not worth knowing, or we know that it's awful, an unbroken saga of racism, sexism, and class oppression. In practice, at most every college and university in the land, the college provides an unintelligible mishmash of unconnected courses. It routinely excludes conservative ideas. It aggressively promotes progressive ideas. And worse still, the curriculum fails to teach those classically liberal principles that clarify why a proper liberal education includes study of both progressive ideas and conservative ideas. How can we blame our students for their ignorance of free speech and their contempt for due process when our colleges and universities don't bother to require all students, as a condition of graduation, to have acquired knowledge of their nation's founding moral and political principles, cornerstones of justice for all liberal democracies everywhere? In conclusion, liberal education is not neutral, and no serious proponent of it ever said it was. In the words of John Stuart Mill, the aim of liberal education is to form capable and cultivated human beings. That is, individuals fit for freedom, fit for self-government in the double sense of governing oneself and participating in governance of the nation. For liberal education to contribute to liberal democracy in America, it must concentrate on its own affairs. It must focus on furnishing and refining students' minds. This requires universities to foster free speech, notwithstanding its limitations. But if universities want true liberty of thought and discussion on campus, they will also have to safeguard due process and provide a solid core to the curriculum. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. There's so many interesting questions raised and avenues we could pursue, but maybe I'll try to shape it. We can discuss among ourselves in the spirit of free speech and argue even in the spirit of free speech for a few minutes, and then take questions and comments from all of you. I think there are two that so in the spirit of free speech, I'll be slightly devil's advocate-like and push back, and I'd love to hear all of you on the question. So answer the following challenge, which is, aren't all of you, but especially I suppose Peter and Bill, being too nostalgic? I mean, were things so wonderful? Bill Buckley's book, God and Man at Yale, is a lament that Yale no longer, as I vaguely remember it from 40 years ago, but I believe this is right, is a lament that Yale no longer inculcates Christianity in its students. It's not a plea for free speech. It's, if anything, slightly hostile to the degree of freedom that's prevalent on the Yale campus then. When I got to Harvard in 1970 and was there, I would say this economics, which is the largest, I believe, discipline, has the highest number of undergraduates studying it, was much more uniform and intolerant as a discipline, I would say, and certainly the way it was taught at Harvard, than it is today. I mean, it was not respectable not to be a Paul Samuelson. There was a spectrum of opinion from sort of soft Marxism to conventional Keynesianism. Milton Friedman was this oddball in Chicago who maybe understood a little bit about monetary policy but had nothing broader to say. Hayek was not even known in economics departments. Von Mises, who probably is really a genuinely great figure in the history of economics, could not get an appointment, I believe, in any economics department in America. And I think today, in fact, there's quite a lot of conservative economists and liberal economists and neo-Marxist economists. The same could be said, incidentally, for the study of political philosophy in the old days. I mean, there was much more uniform kind of, in general, I'd say in the 50s and 60s, the college, one has the impression, the colleges and universities were in the grip of a kind of soft progressivism and soft modernism in literature, soft progressivism and intellectual history that made it very hard to actually get a hearing for things that we now take for granted, the serious study of the classics, not assuming that later thinkers have improved over earlier thinkers. So Ed Banfield just finally, so that's more on the intellectual side. On the actual free speech side, I don't know, Ed Banfield was shouted down so much at the University of Pennsylvania in the mid-'70s when he had left Harvard to go there, that he came back to Harvard, actually, which was actually a bastion of free speech, amazingly. But it was, he was really shouted down in the classroom in a way that I don't know that we have many instances of that for all the talk of the last several years of intolerance and so forth. So for writing what, incidentally? For writing a book about urban problems and how, for different, I don't know, time frames of citizens affects their ability to, their tendency to become responsible citizens or not. So anyway, how much are we is the situation as bad as we think it is, and how much are we misreading it against a sort of gauzy view of the past?
Well, Bill, in a way, you helped me make my point. Your point is things have been bad for a long time. They've been shouting down for 40 years. I couldn't agree more. Concerning Buckley, it's true that in God and Man at Yale, Bill Buckley disapproved of the conscription of the curriculum on behalf of progressive causes because he wanted it to teach Christianity. But that doesn't change the accuracy of his description of the curriculum. In fact, you'll remember this from God and Man at Yale. It's by far Buckley's most boring book. Why is it a boring book? Because half of the book is a careful recitation of the syllabi of Yale political science classes and economics classes and theology classes. Whatever the classes, the syllabi are extremely boring. But they make Buckley's point that it's progressivism. I'll just very quickly make one other...
But isn't that worse now? Wasn't it worse than now? I mean, I don't think
Yes.
the syllabi at Yale are boring now.
Yeah.
They're probably more diverse and have more token heterodox conservatives, no?
It's an empirical question. I will register my skepticism that they're more interesting. But here's one distinction I'd make. What was boring in the 50s and 60s and 70s, at least, especially in our field, social science, was boring social scientists taking for granted the goodness of liberal democracy and not investigating its foundations, its implications, its hidden presuppositions, but taking its goodness for granted. What characterizes the university today is outright hostility, a dominant in many aspects of social science and certain in the humanities. This is a fundamental change, propagating through classes hostility to the foundations of the country. So I do see continuity, as you suggest, and I'm afraid to say I continue to see decline.
Yeah, just on the founders, you two should get in. Obviously, I mean, and this is due to particular thinkers who were teachers of ours, most of us on this panel, but I mean, I just think if we think of the way the Federalists were taught in the 40s and 50s, it was a stupid, lazy, kind of semi-Marxist account that these were just the spokesmen of the property holders, Hamilton in particular, but even Madison. There was nothing to be learned from it to the degree that it was interesting. It was kind of proto-modern political science. There was, attempts to get to the deeper understanding that behavioral social science was getting to in the 60s. I do think today, partly as a result, as I say, of many people whom we could name who had a huge influence throughout large influence throughout the universities, there's much more serious study. I think this I do think is empirically true. There's much more serious study of the Federalist Papers today than there was 50 or 60 years ago, when allegedly everyone was more respectful of liberal democracy. There were more courses taught where Lincoln, whom Diana has written on so well, and I believe is teaching this term at Harvard, where Lincoln is read seriously and thought about as a statesman than was the case in the 50s and 60s when he was, when there was a sort of denigration of the thought of most of the great American statesmen.
One sentence. That is true. However, those outstanding classes are a very distinct minority, and the vast majority of students don't have the opportunity to take classes with such outstanding professors who take the founding seriously. And I'm keeping this to one sentence, and the vast majority encounter political science classes that are either hostile to the principles of the founding or focus on cultivating the capacity to produce ever more sophisticated regressional analysis. I'll stop there.
Fair enough. Bill, yeah.
I would just add, I mean, my field is history.
Right, so you're the historian here, so tell us what's going on in history.
Really, when you want, with the lazy, pseudo-Marxist, kind of mindless outlook that you're talking about, it can't hold a candle to anything in history, believe me, a lazy, mindless candle. No, and I'll just illustrate with one empirical datum that Mike Andrews will verify for me. We have the devil of a time getting history professors involved in our Jack Miller Center network. Why? Because they don't like the notion of an organization that's dedicated to teaching America's founding principles. They find this a very questionable undertaking, reflexively. And the ones we get in, we have to sort of convince them, now, we're not going to make you indoctrinate people. We have to hold their hands. Am I right? I'm right. The other thing is that judging from the political theorists, many of whom we have in our network, they're all deathly afraid that their subdiscipline, political theory, political philosophy, is going to die in another generation. And they value what we do at the Jack Miller Center precisely because we provide a kind of rallying point and a refuge for the study of the very things that you rightly prize. And so I think I don't think I suffer unduly from nostalgia, but I think things are very bad for some of the things that we in this organization, in this room, prize. And when one of the calamity that we're all sort of waiting for is when your great advisor, Harvey Mansfield at Harvard, retires, and he reaches the age of, 150, they'll probably make him retire. But who will replace him? There's nobody that plausibly could do so. It's a calamitous thought.
Diana, you going to join in?
Well, since you exempted me from my position, I don't know that I need to say anything. I think we're all agreed that liberal education is the ideal. I think it has rarely existed. The obstacles have been various throughout history to real liberal education. Our obstacles may be somewhat new, but it seems to me the answer remains the same. You need to talk more about liberal education and get more people devoted to liberal education. Can I ask a quick question of Peter?
Fine by me.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Great.
I liked your list of all the things that ought to be done on the universities, but would you be worried that if universities started having freshman orientations on free speech, that those orientations would be led by the current student life administrators?
Yes.
I mean, that is that they are actually the worst group on campus. It isn't the faculty. It's the student life administrators. They're the ones in charge of all of the indoctrination programs.
You're right. This is an even larger problem, though, than your question suggests for someone like me who also advocates a return to the core curriculum. Who's going to teach that core curriculum? The only people left on the faculty. Again, my assessment of the situation is that the sorts of outstanding scholars that Bill was describing are not a small minority, a tiny minority on campuses. Create a core curriculum, it will be taught by people who are hostile to the civilization, have a one-sided view of things, and who don't believe it is their job to encourage students to think for themselves, but believe it's their job in the classroom to inculcate a certain set of attitudes toward the text. So this is indeed a problem, but I still would prefer this than a situation in which freshman orientation is exclusively devoted to the idea of diversity and inclusion and shutting down speech because it causes harm. You might be able to, against the dominant majority's view of things, expose students to an idea that could plant a seed and open them up to freedom of speech. But I take very seriously your concern, yes.
Let me I'll tell a very quick story, which very much picks up on what you were just saying, and then ask sort of a second question, which we can all discuss briefly, and then open it up. So I was on the board of visitors of George Mason University, which is a good public university in Northern Virginia, sort of the second tier of the Virginia system. UVA and William & Mary are the kind of prestige universities, and the more liberal education-focused universities. And George Mason, among many others, is bigger and has more non-traditional students, older students, more professional and vocational type programs. Really an admirable place, though. Large number of first-generation immigrants, children of immigrants who go there and study computer science, nursing, education. So slightly different function, but some, of course, liberal education too. There's English department, good economics department, a good law school. And so when I was on the board of visitors, which is Virginia system sort of set up in a bizarre way, so you have some power over the university, but then there's also the state government that has a lot of power. You're appointed by the governor to this board. Terrible job, I've got to say. You get, no pay, monthly meetings. Everyone hates you. You get maybe you get better seats at the George Mason basketball games. And that's about all you get. So there was a big debate. They wanted to have a core curriculum, and I think some of it was driven by a sense that, well, we're becoming a more serious university. George Mason had originally been a community college and a teacher's college, and then had gotten prestigious economists and others. So it was people like Seymour Martin Lipset in social science. And so there was a sense that, well, if you're a serious college and university, you have a core curriculum. And so I was well disposed to that for the reasons that Peter just said. And they presented it to the board. And we went back and forth, and there were a lot of discussions. And I ended up voting against it, actually, on the board, and we defeated it. Because I thought, you know what, I would trust more these students just taking what they want and stumbling into a good class, and some of them will stumble into bad classes. But this core was going to be the weakest departments at George Mason, and the professors who couldn't get people to take their classes, just teaching a dogmatic, left-wing, sort of currently fashionable set of ideas and texts. And so it raises a broader question, which is in terms of the strategy of reform. Are we in favor of, should one be in favor of the kind of core curriculum and, a kind of centralization, as it were, to, make sure the place is committed to liberal education? Should one be in favor of, in a way, a certain kind of libertarian almost, let 1,000 flowers bloom, because at least then, 37 good flowers will bloom, and that's 36 more than you'll have if the central administration with all the deans and associate deans that Diana sort of mentioned can get their hands on everything. So I think it's an important issue, I think, for Jack Miller and for others. Are we setting up little islands of sanity in a sea of not such great stuff? Can we change the overall colleges and universities? And finally, and relatedly, I think it sort of does also, who is the core of the problem? Administrators, faculty, or is it, as Diana sort of interestingly suggested, more the culture and society as a whole and social media, which raises its own challenges? Can the universities and colleges be islands of free thought in what's always going to be in any society, of course, a certain kind of uniformity of opinion? But that was the point of colleges and universities. They were supposed to be different, and maybe they aren't as much anymore. But anyway, any aspects of those, I'd be interested.
Could I just add things about the cost? Your analysis seems sound to me. I can imagine voting the same way that you did, but we should be clear about the cost. It seems to me that a proper liberal education, the ideal liberal education, involves a core. It seems to me quite plausible in the contemporary situation that instituting a core would cause more harm than good. But we should be aware that there's a cost, and the cost will be, if we're allowing a few flowers to bloom, that there won't be a common knowledge of the principles of due process. There won't be a common knowledge of the principles of free speech, and we will be stuck in a situation, maybe the best situation that we can hope for, in which the defense of freedom of speech will fall on deaf and ignorant ears because we haven't educated students in these principles.
Diana?
Yeah, I mean, in that situation, maybe a university-wide core curriculum is not the answer. It might be better to have things like a great books major, where you have small group of faculty who are willing to propose something like that and get it established. But there are other places that have existing core curriculums, and there I think it's usually worth trying to defend the existing core curriculum and prevent it from being gutted. At my institution, Jesuit institution, Loyola, still has a very respectable core. Students do a year of philosophy, a year of theology, required foreign language. There have been various attempts over the years to scale back the core, and those have all been resisted by faculty. So even though there aren't that many conservatives on the faculty, there are a lot of people that I would call curricular conservatives. Mm-hmm. And they're really willing to defend that extensive core.
And the faculty defend it. I mean, does this imply that we would be better off with more faculty governance and less administrative governance?
I think that's certainly true. Yeah.
Just say, I think one of the beauties of a core curriculum is that it introduces an element into the life of the institution that is apolitical or potentially apolitical. And there was a place like St. John's College, which is a place I know pretty well in Annapolis and Santa Fe. They have the core curriculum of core curriculum. And in some ways, it's extremely conservative in the most elemental sense of conservative curriculum. But the faculty politically are, they're actually probably a little bit more varied than the usual college or university. But they're not all on the right politically, not even a majority. I'd say a tiny minority on the right politically at St. John's. But it doesn't matter in the classroom, and I can say that as a graduate of the place, and both of my kids went there, that they never felt oppressed by the political take of the faculty. And I think some of it had to do with the fact that there's only so much time you can spend reading Plato's Republic and complaining about the status of women in ancient Greece. And you've got to move on, If you can do that, and yes, and then, whereas in a conventional history course, you'd spend all your time talking about that, or you'd be asked to at any rate. So I think it brings you back to the text. You ultimately have to concentrate on the text, and that is the way you learn how to read, you learn how to think, you learn how to appreciate beautiful things. That's another thing, by the way, that education should do, is not only teach critical thinking, but appreciation of the beautiful and the good. And that's something else that a core curriculum can do, is place those kind of objects worthy of admiration in front of students. They don't get a lot of that, actually. They get particularly in American history, which is my field, is just all flaws and warts. But show them some of the beauty.
I want to ask you about the course you talked about, Diana. You were going to say something else.
Just maybe a very concrete suggestion. Lots of liberal arts institutions now have a summer reading assignment for incoming freshmen in particular, and it might really be worthwhile trying to make a push for John Stuart Mill on Liberty to be adopted as that text. I mean, if necessary, you could pair it with, is there some statement against free speech that would be that could be, said in opposition to it. But
I guess.
Yeah. So that
well,
could,
I mean, really.
Yeah, that could really get students talking about that issue in a way that makes it a little bit more grounded.
Yeah,
but it does mean, I mean, I used to teach Mill in my intro politics class for the first decade that I taught, and the longer you teach, the more you scale back the readings because you realize you just have to go a lot slower. And Mill dropped out somehow, but I'm definitely going to put Mill back in. It seems to me that's the text that everybody ought to be reading now.
Bill, you have this new course. Talk. Well, we'll say what you were going to say, but then
and
also
Milton's Areopagite. I can never say that. You were going to ask me a question?
Well, I was just interested, I think, in the story of the course you've
developed
or redeveloped from the course that was taught 70 years before. I just think it's an interesting brief.
Well, it is. It's a variation on the great books kind of theme. The poet W.H. Auden, great Anglo-American poet. In 1941, he was teaching at the University of Michigan. He had just emigrated a couple years before. And he taught a course called Fate and the Individual in European Literature. It was a one-semester course, 2 credit hours. It had over 6,000 pages of reading, everything from the Greek tragedians up to Dostoevsky and some 20th century works, and 9 operas. 9 operas, a whole lot of Wagner. This was all in one semester. And about 5 or 6 years ago, a guy discovered this in the archives and posted it on the internet. And everyone reacted to it saying, oh, well, gosh, students today wouldn't be able to do this. And I have 2 millennial-age children, so maybe but my reaction was, yes, they can. If you challenge them in the right way, if you present it as a kind of, can you make the grade in the Marines sort of challenge? Not everybody is going to. Some people will say no way, but others are going to say yes. I want to see if I can climb that greasy pole. Yes, present me with this challenge. So I talked a couple of colleagues into offering a version of the course at my university. And it's been a fantastic success. We are over-enrolled every semester. Wow. We've kept raising the ceiling on the size of the class, and we keep getting people on waiting lists. And it shows no sign of losing momentum. And it's just a proof of how hungry a lot of young people are for the real thing, for a real challenge, for a real encounter in a non-political way, although we bring political things. And the 3 of us that teach the course are politically all different. We bring a few things in. There's not much you can do with the Aeneid, but with the Tempest, there are things you can do with that, with contemporary things. And so we're freewheeling that way. But and the whole course is taught through Auden, so that every time we do a work, Auden wrote about everything, And so the Aeneid, for example, Auden has a poem called Secondary Narrative, which is, of course, what the Aeneid is. It's sort of the original secondary narrative, but it's also about how Roman history is superseded by the Christian history of the West. It's a fantastic poem, and to see these works as Auden saw them and as he fed on them and appropriated them, this is liberalism. This is an introduction to the tradition. It's freeing you from the tyranny of your moment, which I think is a big thing of what liberal education is. It frees you from the tyranny of being only of your time and place and extends your sympathies more broadly. So thank you for making a pitch. Letting me make a pitch.
And you're teaching this course at a large state university.
It's a large,
and not any selective. It's not in an honors college or anything like that.
No, we're the University of Oklahoma is not a place.
Anyone can apply to be in the course.
Yeah. You don't all think of nerds when you think of the University of Oklahoma. You think of bone-crushing football teams.
Are they in the course? The big.
No, we don't have any football players.
Should we open it up for anything else just on our discussion that anyone wants to comment on?
I just wanted to make one point. It's sort of related to some things you said, and I think agreeing with you. But there's a lot of talk about the lack of viewpoint diversity. That's a term people use, and meaning that the faculties are all on the left and so on. That is not. Speaking for me, that is not really what bothers me. I think I would be bored stiff. I won't name the name of any particular place, a college in Michigan or something like that. But I think I'd be bored stiff if I was around nothing but conservatives. I like the parry and thrust and the way in which my own prejudices are being challenged all the time. I can cope with it. It could get worse, but. What I object to, and it has to do with due process, is that there are not enough people who are sort of honest liberals. That is, they're willing to be John Stuart Mill-like. They're willing to entertain the possibility they may be wrong, that you may be right, and even if you're wrong, you deserve a hearing because that's the way we do things. It's that ethic that we need much more than we need viewpoint diversity. I wouldn't care having a whole all Marxist faculty if everybody was guided by those due process principles of academic interchange.
If I may add to amplify what Bill says, I quite agree. I think it's actually a mistake to encourage universities to look for political conservatives, to hire political conservatives, even though I also think there is a problematic dearth of political conservatives on campus. So how would I deal with that problem? I would focus on gaping holes in the curriculum. For example, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that diplomatic history, constitutional history, and military history these days are not much taught. I try to fill some of those holes. Now, it's going to turn out, for whatever reason, that these days people attracted to the study of constitutional history, diplomatic history, and military history will be more conservative. But if you're searching to fill the holes in the curriculum rather than to get political conservatives, first of all, you avoid further politicizing the university. And as Bill suggests, you may well end up with an honest liberal who wants to teach Churchill because Churchill is an important actor, an important voice, an important mind.
No, I think that just as a tactical matter, well, go ahead, Diana.
But that's the only field you can think of like that, isn't it?
No.
In other words, in the humanities,
Why?
generally, I don't think you could try to target particular gaps in the curriculum.
I don't know the humanities that well these days either, but my sense is there's a far more these days teaching of high literary theory and less teaching of classical texts. Moreover, in the field of political thought, not on this panel, but out there in political science departments. I'll take one political science department that I know pretty well, my university at Stanford. It generally doesn't offer even courses on political thought, and try to study Edmund Burke or Friedrich Hayek at Stanford University, maybe once in a blue moon or so. So yes, it may be more of a challenge, as you suggest, in the humanities. But I'm betting if we sat down and we looked at various curricula, we could find what we regarded as holes and problems that we would want filled. Although, of course, the danger is, fine, go ahead, find somebody to teach 19th century English Romantic poetry, and he or she will teach it in a way that focuses on the injustices to women in early 19th century England. That's still a big danger.
Of which there were many, I would like to say.
Of which there are many.
Empirical here.
But it's not the only thing to say
but I would
about
say,
Blake and Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley and Keats.
So the advantage of that, though, is, I'll just make two quick points. I mean, I'd say at the board of trustees level, the kind of maybe state legislator level for public universities, I think it's much easier to make the case to them and for them to make the case. They get nervous if it's like, gee, there are too many liberals. How am I going to judge? And how do you appoint conservatives? And that has its own problems. And it's very easy for the university administrator types to say, well, that would be inappropriate for you to be judging.
Yes.
But if someone just says, I've just looked through the catalog of X university, public university, and there's no course on Shakespeare, or there's no course in which they read the Federalist Papers, there's no course in which anyone learns any military history, I think that's a little bit easier just as a way of getting some changes in the university. Yep. So just as a practical matter. And then look, even if the stuff is taught badly, I think I would argue at least that if they read good books, even if taught badly, at least they're reading the book, and they might think about it and decide that it's not being taught to them well. Whereas if they never read the book, you don't even have that option. So I think the notion that Bill laid out is all of you laid out really, is very helpful there about the way in which one can get these. I've just found this much in dealing with, so to speak, citizens who have some oversight responsibilities for higher education. The absence of certain things in the curriculum is an easier case to make than they feel nervous about judging how someone's to teach poetry. What do they know is their attitude. But if you just say, gee, the most famous people who've ever written, the students never read them, that's a pretty good argument. Questions, comments? Jack Miller.
My question would be, you've got the problem, we all know there's a problem there, but what's the solution? You mentioned two things that you think help solve it. What part can the philanthropist play? In other words, there are people who give hundreds of thousands, there are people who give 100 million to universities. So what part can the philanthropist play in order to help change what's going on campus?
I think you've all benefited from one way or the other from various philanthropists, and I have a couple of thoughts on this too, so go ahead, Diana.
Donors should.
Okay, what part should philanthropists or donors, presumably, what part can they play in helping solve the problem of freedom of speech, but also more broadly, I think, of liberal education on campus?
Well, donors should reconsider their financial support for universities that don't defend free speech.
Amen.
And that means donors at all levels, including, what you give to your alma mater. Everybody should re-examine that. But then I think there can be a curricular response too. The support of the kind of curricular moves that would be of assistance in reviving liberal education.
I'd agree with that. Be very careful about sort of large gifts to endowment and things that you lose control over completely very quickly, because universities will do whatever they want in the end, whatever assurances they give you. I don't speak from experience on this, except the experience of watching endowed chairs migrate I taught at Tulane University for 12 years, and I saw it happen, that donors would give money for an endowed chair at one thing, and then when the principals were dead, the money would move to another department and serve a completely different purpose. So I don't trust them. And it's not just Tulane, I don't trust any of them. And I don't think you should either. But you should trust the Jack Miller Center. But no, seriously, there are organizations like ours that really are involved in keeping an eye on what's going on and spotting who are the good deans and provosts and presidents and institutions. Because institutions have a momentum of their own, as you all know. And one size doesn't fit all, and I think you have to be very attentive to the particulars in a way that one philanthropist operating on his own can't be. You need a lot of eyes and ears. You need the help of sort of donors trust type organizations, I think, to see what the right thing is to do.
Peter?
I agree. Elaborate 2 points. One, we have to appreciate that the problems in our universities are deeply entrenched, and generally, for the most part, they don't want to be changed. And in the near term and the intermediate term, it's not reasonable to expect any major transformation. Therefore, it seems to me the kinds of supplemental programs that, yes, the Jack Miller Center is involved in, but also Hertog Political Studies, the Tikva Fund, Claremont's Publius Institute, the Hudson Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, many other, yes, conservative organizations are engaged in standing up programs that enable talented young undergraduates to get what we regard as an introduction to a proper liberal education. This seems to me, in the short term and even in the intermediate term, one of the most productive activities that donors who care about liberal education can engage in.
And I would
So thank you.
add one other thing. I mean, Mike mentioned the conversations with Bill Kristol that I've done. They're online. Actually, we've done Bill McClay. We haven't been able to arrange this. We have to schedule that, but we've done I've done a couple with Peter. We've done one with Diana on Frederick Douglass, which I highly recommend, and we're going to do Lincoln soon. So those are online. They're an hour and a half. They, I hope, introduce students to a lot of different topics and subjects and thinkers and statesmen. Introduce them also to very good students and interpreters of people's thoughts, so they can then go both learn more about the topics of the discussion and also read Diana and Bill and Peter, and also people they refer to. Peter and I did a conversation on liberalism where Peter tried to point students who might listen to this, either as a podcast or watch it online, to who they might read and how they might think about these different thinkers. And we should remember the ultimate goal is to influence young people's thinking. I mean, the campus happens to be in our society and in modern society generally where they go for 4 years or so at a certain age, which is a good age for them to study. But it's, of course, not always been that way. And there are many people who learn, and many people we know who learn much more off campus than on campus. So I'm also a big fan of the summer and supplementary programs and even lecture series and other things, but also just online or other kinds of ways of getting people to learn. It's the point. Reforming the universities, I think, is harder than teaching young people, or as a practical matter. There are many more ways to teach young people. Think of when students of Leo Strauss basically rediscovered classical political philosophy and how important it was and how it hadn't been overcome or transcended or left behind by modern thought and so forth, and how even early modern thinkers needed to be studied in a new way. I mean, what did Strauss, as I understand it, have them do? He had them, the chance to get good faculty appointments for a lot of his students that was very chancy. One didn't know how a lot of them, the universities were not friendly to them, but he actually made them, or at least pushed them, to translate the books. Because once the books are translated in good translations with good introductions, you never know who's going to pick up Alan Bloom's translation of Plato's Republic and what influence that's going to have with a commentary. And so that's the equivalent, I would say. That remains important, but the equivalent of getting to students outside of the normal channel. We can't control how the Republic is taught, or to some degree whether the Republic is taught, but we can at least make sure that the material is available and accessible, and hopefully more accessible if we can promote some of it, than less so to young people. So I think broadening the aperture a little bit from the campus to educating young people or educating citizens. Diana worked with Amy Cass and Leon Cass on that wonderful collection, So Proudly We Hail, of American documents. And there's also online more documents, and it's organized by holidays. And I find, actually, I try to promote it a little bit on Twitter, if I can mention something that's not generally good for liberal education, probably. But in this case, I'm doing my bit to contribute. And I do think some people do they read Frederick Douglass's speech on the meaning of July 4th because maybe they randomly follow me or someone else on Twitter, and they say, I didn't really know anything about that. I never studied Frederick Douglass in college, and I barely know who he is. Donald Trump thinks he's a guy he's alive, but he's having a comeback. He's doing very good work. Wasn't that what he said about Frederick Douglass about a year ago? Which was good. I mean, it was better than saying the opposite, And some people go read that speech, and they read little notes about it that I think Diana wrote in this case, also guidance to it, and then they go read something else. And you could get yourself educated that way, even if you don't have the good fortune to go to a college that has someone intelligent teaching Frederick Douglass. So I think thinking more broadly than just how do we get this course fixed at this college is a good idea. Yeah.
I have a question. My name is David Hiller. I work with the Robert R. McCormick Foundation here in Chicago. And my colleague Sean Healy, who runs our democracy program, is here. And to talk about widening the aperture, we do a lot of work to bring quality civic education back into the high schools and even to the middle school and earlier. Could you, from your perspective, comment on how the students who arrive on campus are prepared to engage in what you'd like them to engage in, and what role you see earlier on at the K-12 level?
Diana, you've done a lot of work. The book itself is designed for, the work you did was
hope that
designed for high school students to some degree.
High school and college, but high school in particular. Yeah, they're not prepared. And to the extent they are prepared, they are misprepared.
Could you elaborate?
Yeah, they arrive believing that the founding is something that we must be ashamed of. So I do think it's very important early on in an American political thought class to confront the question of slavery in the American founding, and to confront it honestly and let them read the primary materials and spend a fair amount of time working through that. It's actually very hard to get students to take seriously the separation of powers or Federalist 10, Federalist 51, until you confront that essential bias that they arrive with. If you don't begin there, you really won't have most of them.
Is the problem, I guess your answer surprised me. I kind of expected you to say they don't know anything about any of this. But
No, mostly they don't know anything, but what they do know stands in the way of their interest and further commitment to the to the project. Yeah.
Bill, Peter?
I think of the old blues song "Born Under a Bad Sign." Has the line, "If I didn't have bad luck, I wouldn't have no luck at all." It's substitute history, and that's where the kids are. If they didn't have bad history, they would have no history at all. But I think another element that's missing, and I'm sure Diana would agree with this, but is that they lack a sense of the American story, of the fact that this is a nation that has a great story. It's not an uninterrupted melodrama of unfolding perfection, Rebecca's Sunnyfield Farm or whatever, but it is a great story. It's one of the great stories of human history. They're a part of it. And yet they have no sense of the shape of American life, of the shape of American history. And I credit my colleagues in the historical profession for doing everything they can to demolish the sense of there being a grand narrative that links together the aspects of American history. But once you have a sense of a story, then you can remember things. Then you can remember and place the pieces. You can, oh yeah, there was this. Oh yeah, there was that. Instead of it just being, as Henry Ford said, history is one damn thing after another. Which, if you don't have a narrative, that is what it is. It's one damn thing after another, or one damn thing before another. So I think that's something else that's lacking is a sense of the narrative of the grand arc of American history.
Yeah, I mean, there are some exceptions. The children of immigrants are usually more committed to the American project. And there are occasionally students who had parents who dragged them around and did a lot of historical tourism. And that's really good. That usually makes them a little bit more receptive. I would also say for a high school reading, there needs to be a return to biography. Sometimes I do encounter students who've discovered biography on their own, and they just, I had a kid recently who said, oh yeah, I've been reading 3 different biographies of Teddy Roosevelt. I've gotten really interested in Teddy Roosevelt. So there are students who will discover that and pursue it on their own, but they've never read biography as a part of their schooling.
Peter?
Yeah, I have an experience every year overseas that brings out, throws into sharp relief the truth of what Diana and Bill have been saying. I've had the opportunity now for several years to teach the principles of the American founding overseas in Israel. And each year, some point during the class, Israeli students ask me, is teaching us about the American founding, constitutional principles, is it different from teaching American students? And the answer is yes. Like the American students, you don't know very much, you know next to nothing about the founding or about the arc of American history. But in another respect, you're easier to teach than the American students because they don't bring the hostility and the prejudices into the classroom, my Israeli students. They're open. Actually, they're not knowledgeable, but well inclined to America and the founding. So it's actually much easier getting started overseas. And I should add, I've also had this experience teaching the American principles in Korea and teaching a group of students, in a way the most inspiring teaching experience I've had with students from Myanmar, Burma, 3 years ago at the George W. Bush Presidential Center. Never had I encountered anywhere students so hungry to understand these principles. All they knew, one student said to me, we don't really know what the American Constitution and democracy and freedom stand for. This is in Dallas. He said, but we know we want them. Can you imagine beginning a class like that in the United States?
Wow.
Yeah.
I guess we should all go to Burma, or Myanmar.
Well, it is connected to Diana's point about the children of immigrants.
I found that
yes.
very much. But I would just, one point that Diana made quickly, and I'll just maybe dwell on it a tad, that when you're in a debunking culture, if that's what we are in, a lot of people looking for the warts, as Bill put it, I do think it doesn't work terribly well, is my sense, to simply ignore them and kind of go to a more traditional, where the highlights and the greatness of America. And a friend of mine who teaches literature at a university was teaching a kind of traditional, he's an excellent teacher, and he was teaching very intelligent interpretations, but it's sort of a traditional curriculum of, well, the Auden curriculum maybe, of the greatest hits of mostly British and then American literature, and maybe some French, translation thrown in. And he realized at some point that this was too easy to just say, well, this is just Western civilization, it's dead white males and so forth. And so he radically changed the course. He has all kinds of third world authors, many of whom are great, obviously. I'm no expert on this, but V.S. Naipaul or Chinua Achebe, I'm going to stipulate here, they're probably as good as better than most of the American or other authors who one reads in about the 20th century. Introduced women, which is, it's not as if there aren't the very greatest novelists, weren't women and aren't. And poets as well, obviously. And he said he thought it was much more effective to teach a course in that way, that maybe at some abstract level one resents slightly the fact that, I don't know if one does even resent, but it's this, one has to adapt to the times, but that not looking as if this was the 1962, Harvard, history of Western literature class, and it looked like, so to speak, looked like a 21st century class. He thought was very, very helpful, and the point was, and they did read great books, and they read them with a little more of an open mind, he thought. And I think maybe it's the same is very true, I think, especially with America and slavery, I agree, but other topics as well. Final question? Michael Weiss, okay.
I'm a graduate of the University of Missouri, where the first thing they taught you there was to say Missouri.
That's good. and it worked, so that's good. Yeah.
And it worked. It's also the home of the first school of journalism in the world, where it has flourished for 110 years, and where 4 years ago, a professor by the name of Melissa Click was seen overtly and on tape squelching free speech. It's not surprising, I suppose, that the university has, in the ensuing years, had difficulty attracting students. Applications are down, student enrollment is down, and apparently the people who pay for this education, which is still predominantly parents, rebelled. And so it occurs that one of the things that's happened in the last 30 years is that publicly financed student loans may have separated the people being educated from the people paying for their education. And so I wonder, is it a completely wayward idea to suggest that someone who applies for and receives a publicly financed student loan should not, as a condition of receiving that loan, take a course in American civics, take a course that washes them, that explains to them how the plumbing works?
Well, we answer that question and also make whatever final comment you want to make in
I think it's a great idea. I like it.
Came from a graduate of the University of Missouri.
Well,
Peter?
Well, it's really Diana's thought, but my inclination is to favor it, but I don't see how to overcome an objection that Diana raised earlier, which is who will teach such classes. But I'll emphasize this, in general, it's dangerous, but these days I'm not opposed to considering the tying of federal funds to universities to conditions. For example, honoring freedom of speech at private universities.
Don't we have to tie the pay for to the result? Isn't that true in every other aspect of our society?
Yes, but we don't have time right now to examine the ways in which universities represent extraordinarily bizarre kinds of markets, which make it very difficult to impose this principle, this sensible principle that governs so many other areas of our life. But I'm with you in striving to find ways. The great private universities receive hundreds of millions of dollars every year in research funding, in addition to the federal funds that enable students to afford the sky-high tuition. If you could find a way to condition federal funding on better behavior toward liberal education, I'm for it. But for reasons that Bill and Diana have mentioned, I want to see the plan and think through it very carefully because a lot could go wrong.
Just say one quick thing.
One quick thing?
The only problem I see with this is that should all happen earlier. A gentleman from McCormick made a very interesting intervention in bringing up K through 12, and I think teaching of the American story at that level, teaching of civics education at that level is a very different matter of doing.
Well,
it.
David and Sean do.
But look, there are
tremendous
not.
work.
I wanted to say, if I could lean on. Do you want to say something, Diana, first? I would lean the other way. I would prefer to have less federal control over the substance of curriculum. Given, if you want the Obama administration or the Trump administration, in my view, you have to go back a couple of ways to have an administration I trust, and I wouldn't even trust them, honestly, the Bush administration, to judge.
How about George Washington?
And it's not true that most federal funds have those kinds of results orientation. Federal subsidies for housing don't tell you what kind of house to build. They give you very loose guidelines, and that's true of most programs, which I think is a good thing in a free society with a limited government. Public schools, we have a test case. 90% of American kids go to public schools. Those are entirely funded by the taxpayers. Are we very happy with the way in which civics are being taught at those schools? I think not. So I'm nervous about assuming that one can use the political process in that way to fix the problems we're discussing.
Some states like Illinois,
Yeah.
by the leadership of McCormick, David and Sean, have passed enabling legislation requiring the teaching. And the irony in all of this is that there aren't the teachers to teach it.
Well, that's a question. And then it gets to the schools of education. There are many different aspects here. But obviously the political process can help a little bit, I think, in certain ways. But I'd also be very wary personally about it. And in a way, whatever. So there's a tension. And I think it's worth being careful and thinking about it, as people here have said, in the way in which one tries to pursue that.
Thank you.
Mike.
Well, hey, I hate to tyrannically
Mike,
cut off.
just to cut in, and of course, the Jack Miller Center is doing some work connecting scholars that we work with. Diana this past summer, and Bill McClay as well, with high school teachers, especially here in Chicago. As Sean knows some of the work we've been doing, but I just wanted to mention that as I dropped the mic.
Okay. Well, it's a sin to be the tyrant who cuts off a discussion of free speech. But I would like to, first of all, please join me in thanking our panelists.